Facebook. There we go on YouTube. So I try to get it posted. It's not too hard, but sometimes it just gets away from me. So here's the situation. We're going to do the beginning of Acts 18 today, taking Paul to Corinth. While Paul's in Corinth, he's going to spend a year and a half there, even though we only have like 18 or whatever 20 verses of description of Paul being in Corinth. He does spend a year and a half there. We'll discuss why that might be. But then we'll go on our next time together. Let's jump to 1 Thessalonians. 1 and 2 Thessalonians are both written probably back to back, maybe weeks apart, a month apart, who knows? But they're written from Paul's stay here in Corinth. So we have discussed the context of Acts 17 and Paul's time in Thessalonica a few weeks ago. And now we'll study 1 and 2 Thessalonians. So one of my encouragements to you would be read 1 and 2 Thessalonians several times, maybe read a chapter a day. I think 1 Thessalonians has 5 chapters, that's 5 days. 2 Thessalonians has 3 chapters, that's 8. So just, go on a cycle of 5, 8 every 8 days. You're reading through 1 and 2 Thessalonians again. Maybe stop for a week and study 1 Thessalonians for 2 or 3 days, or chapter 1, and then 2 or 3 days in chapter 2, whatever, and maybe do different translations. Go to the BibleProject.com and watch the 1 and 2 Thessalonians videos. I think they're pretty good. I don't agree with everything he says in there, but I think he's got some interesting takes on it. But that's good. And so those are some different places to go. And by the way, Karanakar, I think they have, the Bible Project has Telugu. So I'm assuming that they have a lot of their videos that have been translated into Telugu. I think we've talked about that before. So, and actually Anthony's friend who lives over here by me, not far from me, is the one who's responsible for overseeing the translations into the different languages in India. So now with that being said, I think I need to take next week off. I have a publishing deadline of June 1st, and right now I'm not going to make it. So I've got to work. I may need the next 2 weeks off because that publishing deadline, I travel to DC the last Friday of the month. So I've got to finish it before June 1st, which is, I think, a Saturday. I got to finish it by Thursday. So let's plan on taking next week off. And by mid next week, I'll have a good idea whether I'm going to finish it. My goal actually is to finish it by this weekend so I can get people to review it and give me feedback, but that ain't going to happen. So, but I'm writing a text on Gaza and the war and the land. And so it's kind of a synopsis of my book, These Brothers of Mine, as well as a look at the present crisis, as well as the larger crisis. And it's a rush production because obviously Gaza is a present crisis and a present war. So with that being said, so I apologize, but I need next week. I need next week off. First Thessalonians is not a lot of prep time for me, but I just need to be able to probably devote my time to getting the writing done. So I apologize for that. So okay. And the good news is my commentary is all done. Literally in the last 2 minutes before I got on here, I sent the last review of the last review. Every time I go to do a last review, I'm like, hey. So this morning I sent him the last review. I'm like, I noticed this. We should change that. And he did, which is great. He's like, well, I changed it. Well, you need to look at it. So I looked at it again and sent that to him. So that's all done. We have to do an index, which is just like, where does this Bible verse appear on what pages? So that'll take a couple of days, but that's okay. And then Scott McKnight, some of you guys know Scott McKnight. He's writing the forward for me. So that'll be good because his name being on the front cover will help. That as well, but they said it was going to be out in June, but they weren't happy that I said, hey, Scott McKnight said yes. So like, well, that's going to push it back a couple months, Rob. I'm like, it's okay. So but maybe June, July, my commentary will be out. So thank you for that. And then my devotional guide is still with an agent and Debbie. Some of you guys know Debbie, and it's being brokered out to a bunch of publishers. So we'll see what happens with that. But I'm okay with them not hearing from them because if I hear from them, I can't. I don't have time to touch it right now. So, but hopefully that'll be done by the fall. It's a devotional guide, like 1 year through the Bible. So obviously the idea would be to have that out in like October for a Christmas sale. So you can buy all your Christmas presents. So, okay. All right. Thanks for that. Let's open with a word of prayer. I hope I'm not too distracted today. And let's get started. So Father, we thank you today for your mercy and your grace. It's troubling times in so many ways. 20 million people displaced. I think it's 5 million people starving. Famine in Sudan. The war in Ukraine is not coming to an end, and obviously we see no hope in sight for Gaza and the Palestinians, and we fear for our brothers and sisters in the West Bank as well. And we know what this means for Israelis. It's just not good. Anti-Semitism, and then the protests, and we just see a world in turmoil, and we see the people in power thinking that war is the best option, and we fear for what that means for us and for others and for the world. And so we just ask, Lord, that you'll help us to see your face and to follow you. We thank you for all that you've given to us. We ask your blessings upon us. Guide us now in this discussion, this conversation, as we study the scriptures. Speak to our hearts individually as well as corporately. Be with us now in all that we do. We thank you for these things. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Before I forget, we have a live stream tomorrow night. As if you're watching this, obviously on YouTube, go to the YouTube channel and you'll find it there with an Iranian pastor. I'm not going to say his name. I probably will say his name on the live stream, but it won't matter for you guys. But so we're going to talk about Christianity in Iran, Iranian Christians, as well as Iran and the United States. So that'll be a good conversation. That's tomorrow night. I think it's at 6 o'clock Pacific time, which would be 6:30 a.m. on Friday morning for our brothers in India, and 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock, I think, Bob and Jackie, I think where you are, I think you're 2 hours from us, right? So be aware of that. And then right now, next Monday night, Danny and I are going to have a conversation right now with one other person, maybe two other people, to talk about the protests on the college campuses, what's going on. I wrote a blog a week and a half ago about that. And, is anti-Semitism and the police brutality and what's going on there. I've got a couple more resources that I'm looking to get. Maybe have another person come on who was on the campuses themselves talking about that. So keep that there. And then the week after that, on Thursday, the 30th, that'll be at 10 o'clock Pacific, 1 o'clock Eastern. We have a live stream with the editor of a book called The Business of War. And so we'll be discussing the book of Revelation, the beast, war, power, and he's a professor at Boston University, an ethics professor at Boston University. This is a fantastic, it's a heady book, but it's a fantastically well done book talking about how war profits. And it's crazy. And they're writing more volumes to this. They're going to make a whole series out of this. I think they're doing the next volume is on mass incarceration and how putting people in prison profits, or people are profiting from imprisonments. And so this is craziness. This is power running wild, or in my opinion, it's the beast running wild. So that'll be May 30th there. And then if you're paying attention to the German Truth podcast, we're getting ready to interview scholar after scholar after scholar to discuss, hey, what do you think of this? We had this week's podcast was Scott McKnight and Cody Matchett. They have a fantastic book. So that's this week's podcast. Then we'll release a couple more episodes with Vinny and I finishing up the book, going through the New Jerusalem and things like that. And then we're lining up more and more scholars to talk about, hey, what do you guys think this means? Some that will have a view more along what I'm thinking of, like, hey guys, this is really relevant for today. And I think a few others that will be like more toned down, but we'll see what they do with it. So keep attention to the German Truth podcast. So okay. Good. Here we go. Acts chapter 18. Does somebody want to read? Let me pull up the text. I think it's verses 1 through 11 to start with. Acts 18, 1 through 11.
I can go.
Thank you.
Paul in Corinth. I'm out of the NRSV. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, he would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him in protest, he shook the dust from his clothes, and he said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the official of the synagogue, became a believer in the Lord, together with all his household, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul became believers and were baptized. One night the Lord said to Paul in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to harm you, for there are many in the city who are my people." He stayed there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them.
Okay. Any thoughts or comments or observations or questions that you guys have from that?
I want to know what the impact of Silas and Timothy coming from Macedonia had to do with what was going on.
Okay. Let me
Because he had been already reasoning in the synagogue, right?
Oh, the impact is now, it seems like that Paul was working and Silas and Timothy to provide for his own well-being. And Silas and Timothy's coming into town and freed Paul up from having to work as many hours as he was and allowed him to devote more time to the word. I think that's the idea.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. So, yep. All right. Anybody else? That was a good thought. Yeah. Okay. Where were Silas and Timothy at previously? Do anybody remember? Vaguely? The last time we saw Silas and Timothy in the text? No?
They were in Greece, weren't they?
Well, yes, but what part is well, Macedonia technically, right? So yeah, so and there's a little bit of a distinction in the ancient world between Macedonia and Greece, but they were in Thessalonica. Remember, Paul had to flee, and they stayed. Paul flees, goes down to Berea, then he goes down to Athens, and verse 1 of this chapter, he left Athens. It's Paul who left Athens. Silas and Timothy are not with him yet, so he's still awaiting them. Appears that he doesn't have any intent on starting a church in Athens, and he goes down to Corinth. So, okay. All right. Very good. Anybody else? Any other thoughts or? All right. While you're doing that, let me go ahead and bring up some, I'm going to share my screen and show you some, I got to shut that. Show you some pictures here. What screen do I want to show you? That one there. Oh, I'm just going to share my screen. I'm just going to do it that way. Okay, so you guys can see whatever I can see. Desktop. Okay. So first off, this is Corinth. I took this picture myself from an airplane. So I had the window seat. We're traveling north. So this is south. This over here is north. If you guys can see my cursor. Is that correct? Okay. So this is the Corinthian canal that was carved, I think, like 100 years ago. You can barely see it right through there. But see this narrow strip of land? That's very significant. Let me go now to the map of Corinth. Okay, so here we go. So I'll see if I can make this bigger. So Corinth is over here. If you see where that red line is pointing to, the arrow right there on that map. And there's a narrow strip of land. It's called an isthmus in English. And an isthmus, so this is a peninsula surrounded by water on 3 sides, right? An isthmus is surrounded by water on 2 sides. And so you can see how Corinth is on this isthmus connecting the Peloponnesian Peninsula down here with the mainland of Athens and everything else up here. And so this very narrow strip of land. Now, what that meant, going back to this, this one here, is that ships, it was, whenever you travel around a cape like this, you're always going to have wind and rough weather, rough seas, because maybe warmer weather over here, colder weather over here. So traveling around a cape of this nature, a corner like this nature, is always difficult sailing. So sailors actually found that it was faster and easier to go in through this little strip of water here, actually literally unload cargo from their ship, put on rollers, because the canal hadn't been carved, roll the cargo across the isthmus, it's 5 miles, roll it across the isthmus, and then load it back up on the other side and set sail to the Adriatic Sea, which I don't think I have a map of this. Oh, there you go. So you go through here and you come up to the Adriatic Sea and you can go on to Rome. So to travel to Rome from, let's say, the Black Sea, Byzantium, Macedonia, Thessalonica, Athens, was actually faster to go through this narrow strip of land and come out here on the Adriatic Sea and go up here to Rome. That meant Corinth has a lot of one-night layover people. And there are people that work on ships. Sailors that are in town for one night are doing things that sailors in town for one night might, yeah, you know what I mean. All right. What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. Okay. Right. Corinth, in fact, the Greek word to Corinthianize, they made a verb out of the word Corinth. And the verb Corinthianize meant to practice sexual immorality. So that tells you a lot about what we're going to get when we get to First Corinthians. So let's see here. I also brought this up. I was looking for my photos and I couldn't find them. So this picture right here, I'm going to move you guys out of the way. That's actually the Acropolis at the top of Corinth. And then this is some of the ruins of Corinth itself. You can see this is obviously taken in the springtime. There's the Corinthian canal that wasn't there at the time of Paul. Mind you, modern day ships can't get through it. It's too small, but you can see how far they had to cut down. So imagine a 5-mile carving of that much rock there to create that there. I want to show you this here. This is the Cardo, or whoops. It's an advertisement for a trip. But anyways, this is at one of the main streets in Corinth, where these are all shops on the side here, and accommodations might be in the back or above it. But this is one of the main streets that if Paul's working in Corinth as a leather worker, we'll discuss what that means in a minute. It may well have been on this street here that he's working, and there's the Aquila Corinth up there where the temple would have been. Aquila Corinth, yeah, that's up there. Let me go back to this here, see if I had another picture. Oh, there you go. That's the same street, just not as nice a day there. And you can see here, and then up right around here, if you kind of go up the street and maybe make a brief little right, would have been the what's called the Bema seat, the judgment seat. It was actually elevated about 10 or 15 feet above the street. That's where we haven't gotten Acts 18 verse 12, but that's where that took place there. That's the same picture there. And then there's also a famous inscription. Okay, that's the same street. You can see why that street's famous. And then there's okay, that's enough for the picture. So let me stop doing this. Let's go read a few other passages in the New Testament that'll help us understand Corinth a little bit. Any questions or comments or thoughts? We're good? Okay, let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to go to 1 Corinthians 1, then we're going to go to 1 Corinthians 16, then we're going to go to Romans 16. So 1 Corinthians 1, I'm not sure what verses I want to look up yet. I didn't get that far ahead. This is Paul talking, this is Paul's letter to Corinth. So this is later. Paul's in Ephesus now, like a year later, and lots of problems in Corinth, even though he stayed there for a year and a half. And let's see, verse 14 of 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one would say that they were baptized in my name. Oh, I did. Verse 16 is totally like one of those. Oh, by the way, now that I remember. Now I did baptize the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I don't know whether I baptized anybody else, because he might forget some names. Okay, now chapter 16, 1 Corinthians 16. And obviously at the end of these letters, you get the greetings, and the greetings give us more names and more individuals. Chapter 16, verse 15. And I'm not looking at the video, so tell me, I'm looking at my Bible app, so tell me if there's any questions or comments. Verse 15, I'll read because it's names, and some of you guys don't like to do the names. But it says, I urge you, brothers, the household of Stephanas, that they were the first fruits in Achaia, devoting themselves to the ministry of the saints. Skip down to verse 17. I rejoice over the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus, because they supplied what was lacking on your part, Skip down to verse 19. The churches of Asia, that's Ephesus, where Paul is, greet you. Aquila and Prisca, that's Aquila and Priscilla, that we're going to discuss in a little bit, greet you heartily, which means they traveled to Ephesus. So they were in Corinth. If you remember what we just read in Acts 18, that's Aquila and Priscilla. And now they're in Ephesus with Paul. They greet you heartily in the Lord with the church that is in their house. So they have to be people of some means if they have a house big enough for 15 to 20 people for the church there. And then I don't think anybody else is named in Acts and 1 Corinthians 16. So let's go now to Romans 16. Okay, Romans 16. And I was going to show you an engraving in a street, but I wasn't going to spend the time to find a picture of it. So, okay, here we go. Verse 1. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church which is at Cenchrea. Okay, I'm going to actually share my screen because I forgot to show you one more picture. Where Cenchrea is. Okay, and to show you Cenchrea, I have to go to my homepage on Facebook. Did it work? Did I do it? Okay, I didn't. I forgot to hit that button. Sorry. Okay, so I need to close that. Okay, so that's the handsome one there. This is me sitting on the shore of Cenchrea. So if you remember the picture of Corinth, that 5-mile isthmus, this is the south side of the port, coming in from the Aegean Sea. Cenchrea was the seaside town where the ships would come to. Corinth was inland. So you land on the Aegean Sea in Cenchrea. This is the remains of Cenchrea. And then you unload the cargo there, travel it inland across the isthmus to the other side. And in the meantime, in the middle of that was the city of Corinth. And so that's where Cenchrea is. Okay, so did everyone have a visual where Cenchrea is? I mean, I know I just showed you the picture of me in Cenchrea, but that's where it's at. Okay, so let's go back to Romans 16 again. So Phoebe is a deaconess. Somebody have a comment? Okay, she's a deaconess, most likely. We'll discuss that later. Of the church in Cenchrea, that's the seaside town next to Corinth. Okay, so nonetheless, verse 3, greet Prisca and Aquila. They're back in Rome. So now Paul, by the way, Paul writes Romans from Corinth. So he's back in Corinth, and he's like, oh, by the way, to the church in Rome, we send Phoebe to you. She's from Cenchrea down at the seaside town there. And she probably is the one who reads the book of Romans, if you've heard our interview with Scott McKnight on that. And then there's Prisca and Aquila. They're actually from Rome, and we'll go back to Acts 18 in just a minute there. Verse 4, they risked their own necks. For my life, they risked their own necks. Whom not only do I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles. Okay, verse 5, greet the church that's in their house. So they have another house church. This time it's in Rome. Okay, let's skip down here to some others. Lots of names here in Acts 16. And there's a couple of them I'm skipping, I think I will, but I want to get down to verse 23. Gaius, verse 22. I, Tertius, who write this letter, greet you in the Lord. So Tertius is in Corinth, and he's the scribe for the book of Romans, and he inserts his own comment as if you're allowed to do that in inspired scripture. Like, this is the writing of the Apostle Paul. Tertius, you don't get any first-person comments, but apparently that was okay. All right, Gaius, verse 23, host to me and the whole church greets you. Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you. And Quartus, the brother. Okay, so now what's important, it's not important, but what's interesting about Erastus, and we'll go back to Acts 18 now, is Erastus is the city treasurer. And there's actually a street in Corinth you can go to today, and you can see the engraving on there that says this street was paid for by Erastus. And it dates to the 1st century. He's the treasurer, and that's the way it worked. I build a street for you guys, help pave the way. You elect me to the office, from which I get even more benefits, and then I do even more things for you. And so Erastus apparently was a member of the church, but he has his own. He built a street, and he didn't put a brick next to his name there. He engraved his whole name. It's like, they build a church and then they have all the bricks for people that dedicated money, or whatever, or the zoo, and they dedicate money for the building of the zoo. Erastus just inscribed his own name there. So, okay, those are some of the people that are flowing around the church in Corinth there. So, all right, any questions as we go back to Acts 18 now? Let's talk about Aquila and Priscilla, if there's any questions. Actually, let's go to the top of your notes because I think there's a fill in the blank. Okay, so Corinth was west of Athens. It's the capital of Achaia, which is the southern province. Macedonia is the northern province. We call the whole place Greece, but that works. They recognize themselves as Greece. The Greek Empire was in days gone by, however, right? The fill in the blank is it's a colony. It's a Roman colony. Like Philippi, that means it's colonized by Rome, and every citizen of Corinth is a citizen of Rome. Okay? All right. Any thoughts or questions or comments? All right. The fill in the blank was it's a colony. 550,000 to 100,000 people, which actually that's a huge city. It might not be big in our day, especially for our brothers in India. That's a small little village in India, right? But it's a large city in the ancient world there, and it had a large Jewish community. Now, the question is this. Paul stays there for a year and a half in Corinth. Oops, I need to go back to Acts 18. And the question is why is Acts 18 and his to stay in Corinth so brief? I mean, all we have is 17 verses. Verse 18, Paul of Acts chapter 18. He loved the brothers. He went to Cenchrea, had his hair cut, and then took off and went to Ephesus, verse 19. Why do we have Paul staying a year and a half in Corinth? What do you think? And yet we only get 17 verses. Because someone else is not.
Luke wasn't there.
Luke wasn't there. Luke wasn't. So Silas and Timothy come down, but Luke's still up in Thessalonica. I think he might even be in Philippi. Luke's still up north. And Luke is writing. One of the things we know about Luke's writing is he says this in the Gospel of Luke. He says, I carefully investigated everything from the beginning. And when Luke is present, especially in the book of Acts, it's really detailed. When he's not present, hey, Paul, can you give me a report of like what you did in Corinth? Okay, cool. Good enough. But because it wasn't firsthand knowledge, Luke is more brief about that. When you go to the book of Gospel of Luke, obviously Luke wasn't present at all, but he's relying on Mary and others that he's interviewing to get detailed analysis as to what actually happened and what's going on. But in the book of Acts, he gets much more. Think of it this way. Paul's going to travel all these years, probably a total of 10, 11, 12, maybe 11 years between the time he starts and the time he ends up in prison, which is where the book of Acts ends. Well, that'd be 60, in prison in Rome. And that's where the book of Acts ends. But so we got 28 chapters. All right, actually, with Paul, you've got from chapter 13 on. You've got the church from AD 30 to AD 60. You got 30 years, and you got 28 chapters, 9 chapters. 9 of those 28 chapters describes Paul's 2 years in prison in Caesarea. Not Paul traveling to this city, not him traveling to that city, not him starting that church there, not having a conflict over there. 9 chapters of Paul's stay in a prison in Caesarea. Luke was with him. Luke's chronicling what happens in that prison. So that kind of gives us an idea as to how it's written. So does that help? I hope. Okay, here we go. Now, it says in Acts 18, the beginning of the chapter, it says, Aquila, a Jew named Aquila. Paul found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus. Now, Pontus is above Galatia, if you remember where that is. I forgot to show it to you when I had the map up, so I apologize. He's actually from Pontus, which is modern-day Turkey, the northern part of modern-day Turkey. It borders the Black Sea. Having recently come from Italy. So remember we read the book of Romans, and he's back in Rome, and he's got a church that meets in his house in Rome. He was in Italy, but he left Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius, who's the Roman emperor from 41 to 54, if I think I have the dates right. Yeah, because Nero's 54 to 68. So Claudius was the Roman emperor before Nero. So it's Nero's stepdad. And Claudius commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he came to them. I'll go back to the Claudius in just a second. Verse 3, because he was of the same trade, meaning Paul was had the same trade as Aquila. He stayed with Aquila and Priscilla, and they were working, for by trade it's probably leather workers, not tent makers. I was noticing as Anthony read, every English translation I pulled up says tent makers. That's the popular understanding in the Middle Ages. It's very likely a leather worker, which means he made more than just tents. He made shoes and other leather things and what have you. No, but they had the same trade. Okay, now here we go. Verse 2 again. Claudius commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So we know from I didn't put this on your notes, but I think this is a fill in the blank. So, here you go. I'm sorry. Let me go through your notes because we have a fill in the blank before that. So letter A, Paul travels to Corinth alone. He's able to settle there. Letter B, he resides with Aquila and Priscilla. They're from Pontus, but they were residing in Rome. And then I put down the references where Aquila and Priscilla appear in the biblical text. So verse 2, verse 18. If I don't put a chapter number, that's the verse within the chapter that we're in right now. So verse 2, verse 18, verse 26. That's on your notes too? Is that right? Yeah, okay, there it is. Yeah, 2:18. And then Romans 16:3, we read that. 1 Corinthians 16:19, I think we read that. And 2 Timothy 4:19. So that's 6 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times Aquila and Priscilla appear in the text. 4 of the 6 times, Priscilla's name is listed first. The first time, it's Aquila and Priscilla. That's the customary, the male before the female. But Priscilla's name, and the fill in the blank is Priscilla. Priscilla's listed first. It suggests that she was more known. And we're going to see later on, she's an evangelist. And Apollos, who we'll get to know later on, is brought to Christ by Priscilla. And it could be Aquila was working in the leather shop and she's out evangelizing and she's out doing ministry stuff. It could also be they had a large home because they were wealthy, a large enough home, and they entertained people. And so she's busy doing ministry while Aquila's busier working as a tent maker and might be helping to support Paul. But notice Paul's going to go to Ephesus. They're going to go to Ephesus. Eventually, they're able to go back to Rome. So that's the fill in the blank there. Okay. They were married. I think they are 2 unsung heroes of the early Christian church. You know, we know Mary and we know Martha and we know the apostles and Peter. You know, we know Philip. You know, we know some of the deacons, Stephen Stone. You know, we know some of these names. But Aquila and Priscilla might be the 2 most significant people that we may never have heard of before. You know, like the second tier names of Paul just mentions names in different letters and Phoebe and da. These guys are really important. Think about this. Paul left Thessalonica because of persecution and he's fleeing for his life and he wants to go back because he's worried about Timothy, who's a young man. He's worried about Silas. He's worried about the church. They're under great persecution and he can't go back. Then he goes down to Athens. Okay, a little conflict there. Everything, it works out well. He makes his way down to Corinth. He's still alone. He doesn't have any friends with him. He's traveling by himself. And these guys take him in. Imagine how important they become for Paul. You know, if we say Paul, you know, it's Jesus, then Paul, or maybe Jesus, then Peter and Paul, you know, depending on whether you're Catholic or not, we'll put Peter up or you know, whatever. We're all good. But as significant a person as Paul is in the New Testament, you got to think Aquila and Priscilla were vital to Paul's thriving as a pastor, evangelist, apostle. Guys, ministry is a lonely, lonely island. People don't understand this. Pastors, you can't complain down. That's the whole idea. Everyone can come to you and complain, but you can't really complain down. And you can only be so transparent for all kinds of reasons. By the way, because people take advantage of you if you complain down too much. They become aware of your weaknesses. And it's so pastors have to find other pastors, other places where they can go to have an outlet, to commiserate together, to say, I'm struggling with this, or this is happening in my marriage, or this is happening in my home, my kids, or my own physical health, or this is happening in my church. All right. Paul's got nobody until he comes with Aquila and Priscilla and stays with them. So that alone, wow. And then they have a big enough house. Paul can stay with them, and then the church can be. These guys, I know I'm going on too long about this. They're really, really, really important. And Priscilla's name being first says something more. Okay, here's the deal. Claudius expelled the Jews. We know this from a Roman centurion. And I think I put this on your notes, if I'm not mistaken. No, I didn't. Okay, never mind. Okay, oh, good. All right. So number one, they were fellow Jews. They were married. They recently come from Italy after Claudius expelled the Jews. A Roman historian said that Claudius expelled the Jews because there was I'll say fight, an instigation would be your translation from the Latin, an instigation over a man named Chrestus. Okay, and if you want to write it down, you can. I'll spell it for you. Chrestus. So Claudius expels Jews because there was an instigation over a man named Chrestus. Chrestus. Looks a lot like Christ. It's likely a misspelling of Jesus's name. Widely agreed by most theologians and Roman historians that there was, remember, Christianity is not distinct from Judaism. Christianity had made it to Rome, and the Jews in Rome, some become, there's 50,000 Jews in Rome. So obviously not all of them converted or transformed into Christianity and began following Jesus. The ones who didn't, you can imagine the conflict. We've seen it in Galatia. We've seen it in Antioch. We've seen the conflict in Thessalonica. They ran Paul out of town. There's got to be a conflict because of Christianity coming to Rome. We know Christianity comes to Rome before Paul because he writes Romans and he's never been there yet. The book of Romans was written from Corinth on his next journey, saying, I'm hoping to get to Rome. I want to visit you. I'm going to Spain. I'll stop there on my way, which is a nice way of saying I'm coming to Rome. It's just like, oh, I'm going to Spain, but if you ask, I'll stay, right? You don't say it that way. You say, I'm going to Spain, and then they ask and you stay. That's right. So Paul hasn't been there yet. We have no knowledge that Peter's there yet either. But the church gets established in Rome, and there's a conflict there. Now, there's no way that Claudius expelled all of the Jews. There's 50,000 of them. So that's likely hyperbole, exaggeration, that he expelled all the Jews. No, he probably expelled the leading ones, the ones that were involved in the conflict. And that tells us that Aquila and Priscilla were leaders in the Jewish community in Rome and were part of the people that were expelled. Only the prominent ones likely are the ones that were expelled. So this again tells you how significant Aquila and Priscilla are for the story. I know we're like on verse 2 and I'm 40 minutes in, but I hope this sets the context for Corinth and what's happening in Corinth and things of that nature. I'll stop there. Any questions or comments?
I'm going to plug Ben Witherington's book on Priscilla. It's actually really good.
Oh, really? I don't know if I read that one.
Yeah, that one's really good. It's
okay.
Very in-depth. It gives you a great perspective.
All right, Ben Witherington. So Wither, Wither, Ington. Ben Witherington. And he's a great scholar in Kentucky. I think he's at Asbury Theological Seminary in Kentucky. So Ben Witherington on Priscilla, if you want to look that up. So, okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, here we go. Now, Paul, here's the next thing. So we saw that row of shops where Paul might have been working in one of those shops there with Aquila as a leather worker until Silas and Timothy come into town. Give them some reprieve, whatever that might mean. Okay. That is, that's not good. Yeah, it's like saying your pastor's a garbage man on the side. Right? Yeah, my church doesn't give me enough money, so I collect trash. Manual labor, working with your hands, was thought to be lower class. And if you're going to be a respected teacher, this is going to be a big issue in Corinth, in the book of Corinthians. Paul, why can't you be like all the other teachers? Why can't you dress nicer? Why can't you speak better? Why can't you tell jokes and make people laugh? Why can't, this is literally what's going on. I mean, I'm paraphrasing it and maybe making fun of it a little bit, but why can't you tell jokes? Why can't you get a laugh? That's very likely what they were saying. Why can't you woo the audience, win them over with your stories, win them over with your great rhetoric? And Paul's like, we'll see this in 1 Corinthians, like, do you guys know what I'm preaching? Jesus Christ crucified. Dress that one up. How do you make that look better? Which I think, by the way, speaks a little bit at least to our modern day mega churches, right? And I see our brother Karanakar smiling a little bit, right? If we dress the gospel up too much, I don't have a problem with dressing the gospel up. I don't have a problem with making children's church great fun for the kids because it gets the parents there too, right? I think that's great. But at some point, you have to tell those kids even that what we're talking about is Jesus Christ crucified. Because those kids grow up thinking it's all about fun and games. And I'm speaking about our American churches. And some of you guys know, many of you guys who are from a church that I worked at in Northern California, there were 500 kids that would go to youth group on Wednesday nights. 500. You guys know, right? And how many of them came to church on Sunday? They were entertained. They got the gospel a little, but they came. And how many of those kids that came on Sunday, they would go to this? Because this is an issue that I know we were trying to address it even at the church. And this is an issue a lot of churches try to address. And that is, do we keep the youth in youth services, or do we bring them into the main service? Do they hear the main pastor, hear the sermon, or do we keep them over there? Because here's the problem. In American churches, when they graduate high school, they've never been to church. They've only been to youth services and kids services. And how many of them actually go to a main service and continue to attend church afterwards? That's an issue. I think that's a side issue than what I'm talking about here. But this is the problem with Paul in Corinth, and that is he's a leather worker, a manual labor, and that's shameful, and it's not good. So okay, let's move on. Let's see. Paul remains in Corinth for a year and a half. He writes 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. He reasoned with them in the synagogue, saying Jesus is the Christ. Remember, in Athens, he has to say, "Hey, you guys have an unknown God," but in the Jewish synagogues, he can start with the scriptures and say, "Oh yeah, you guys are waiting for the Messiah. Well, that was Jesus." Devote himself to the word, and he got a gift from Philippi. I won't discuss that too much. It's a typo, not working for himself. I should say there. Let's see, and then they blasphemed Paul. Let's see, verse 6. Paul shakes out his garments and said, "Your blood be on your own hands. I am clean. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles." That's not going to make him any more friends in verse 6. From there, he went to the house of Titius Justus, who's obviously a Gentile. That's about as Roman a name as you're going to get. He was a worshiper of God, and his house was next to the synagogue. But Crispus, verse 8, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all of his household. Many Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and baptized. And the Lord said, by the way, verse 9 might sound really cool, but if you're Paul, it's red flags. Verse 9 says, "Hey, Paul, let me give you a vision. Don't be afraid any longer." You're like, "Oh, yeah, I don't like that." Because don't be afraid any longer means there are reasons why you should be afraid. I'm just telling you not to be. Right? It means you got trouble ahead of you. But guess what? But keep speaking. And Paul's like, "Yeah, my mouth is what's getting me in trouble. But I'm with you. Don't be silent. No one will attack you in order to harm you." Well, they might attack you. It's kind of like the two witnesses in the book of Revelation. When they finish their ministry, then the beast will kill them. So yeah, until I'm done with you can be harmed, but not like you won't die just yet. I got plans for you. It's like, oh, great. Okay, cool. For I have many people in this city. He settled there a year and 6 months. Let's continue on verses 12 through 17 and see the situation here. And then Paul's going to leave. So somebody want to read Acts 18, 12 through 17.
I can.
Mhm.
But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews rose up together against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, "This man is inciting the people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of some crime or vicious, unscrupulous act, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about teaching and persons in your own law, see to it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge in these matters." And he drove them away from the judgment seat. But they took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. And yet Gallio was not concerned about any of these things.
Anti-Semitism is alive and well, right? Let's beat the synagogue ruler, and Gallio's gonna turn his head. Okay, this is actually really significant for a lot of reasons. I've said before that Judaism was a legal religion in the Roman Empire. That means Rome said, okay, Jews, you guys can practice your religion. It's okay with us. Not only were the Jews allowed to practice their religion, they were actually given certain privileges. Like in every other religion, you have to worship the emperor first. The Jews didn't have to worship the emperor first. They were allowed, okay, as long as you sacrifice for the emperor and give him a prayer in your temple in Jerusalem, that'll be okay. The average Jew in the Roman world didn't have to worship the emperor. They were exempt from a lot of the festivities in the honor of the gods, which caused a lot of resentment by everybody else in these cities because the fate and the well-being of the empire is in the hands of the gods, and you guys aren't worshiping the gods. Anytime anything bad happened, the Jews were going to be the first ones to be blamed because they weren't worshiping the gods. And that included the Christians who were worshiping the same God. They're in the same plight. The Jews were also given certain tax breaks. Mainly, you don't have to pay taxes to the Roman religion. You can pay taxes to the temple in Jerusalem, which meant converts to Christianity. Are you Gentiles like going to stop paying taxes here? That's going to be an issue with the Roman authorities because less revenue is coming in. So are you converting to pay taxes to Jerusalem? All these issues were at bay. So here's the deal. They bring Paul before the governing authority. Gallio was a proconsul. This dude's somebody. In fact, the fill in the blank on your notes is he was the brother to Seneca. You know, Seneca, like the orange juice for you guys in America here. Seneca is the fill in the blank on, let's see, number under 1812A1. He was a well-respected brother of Seneca, the tutor of Nero. His brother was Nero's teacher. Now, Nero isn't in power yet. Nero's a young man whose stepfather was the emperor Claudius. Nero's mom is going to have her husband killed and her son put on the throne. So it's bad family vibes. So, but nonetheless, Seneca is the tutor to Nero. His brother is Gallio, the proconsul in Achaia. Whatever this guy rules becomes the law throughout the Roman Empire. Whatever this case is decided, here's the situation. These guys are preaching another religion. They brought him before the judgment seat. This man, verse 13, persuades men to worship God contrary to the law, meaning they're not Jews. They are preaching a religion different than the Jewish religion. That's what verse 13 is kind of getting at. If that's the case, Christianity would be not legally allowed. This decision becomes vital for the survival of Christianity because otherwise it becomes outlawed, legally outlawed. And it doesn't mean it's going to die. It just means it's going to have to go underground. And Gallio's like, I think you guys have an inter-Jewish dispute going on. Now, note, again, we have very brief details about this dispute because Luke's not there to record it. And apparently he didn't decide to write whatever Paul said. But whatever it was, Paul probably argued back, oh, no, we believe in the Messiah of the Jewish. They're arguing back and forth whether or not Christianity is a valid Jewish religion or not. And Gallio's decision is, this is an inter-Jewish decision. This is an inter-Jewish dispute. In other words, he legally declares Christianity a legal religion because it's Jewish. It's part of the Jewish religion. And the American legal system, I don't know about you guys in India, Karnakar, but in America, if a higher court rules something, it's in vogue throughout the land, especially if it goes up to the Supreme Court. But if a state court rules something, that's the law in the entire state. And the only way it can be overridden is for a higher court to say that decision of a lower court is thrown out. As we call it the law of precedence. Whatever was decided in the higher court, that becomes precedence unless a higher court above that court throws it out. And so Gallio's decision becomes really significant. So the fill in the blank, I think, letter C is Gallio concluded that Christianity was nothing more than a sect of Judaism or of the Jewish religion, however you want to fill in the blank on that. Okay. Now I put down, the other thing about Gallio, by the way, he was only the proconsul for 1 year, and we know the year, meaning we can date this event in Corinth very, very well. He was there from 51 to the beginning of 52 AD, or CE, whatever you want to call that. 51 to 52. That's why we can be very certain about these dates, and because we can extrapolate backwards and forwards with Paul, we have a pretty good understanding of the years that Paul was here, the years that he was there, the years things like that. So Paul, the end of this journey is somewhere around the end of the year 51, beginning of 52. So, okay. Gallio drove them away, and they began to beat Sosthenes. And the answer is, by the way, Crispus, is he in the text earlier in the chapter? I think he is, right? Where's Crispus? Acts 18. Yeah, verse 8. Crispus was the synagogue leader in verse 8. Crispus becomes a Christian. And so what we don't know is, did Sosthenes the one who took his place, or had Crispus not become, but it might be that Sosthenes is the ruler of the synagogue after Crispus. But nonetheless, they beat him up, and anti-Semitism was alive and well. And it was one of those, this is just the way kind of the Roman judicial system works. So, okay. Any questions? Okay. And I think, there you go. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, I didn't read this before, and I don't know if this is in your notes. Yeah, it is. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1, Sosthenes also becomes a Christian. It says in 1 Corinthians 1:1, Paul, an apostle by the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. So, there you go. Sosthenes, our brother. So Paul and Sosthenes write 1 Corinthians. And he was the Jew beaten up. I'm sure he wasn't real happy at this point in time, but somehow he becomes a believer. Okay, any questions, any thoughts, any comments, any ideas? Okay. I hope that this has given you a better understanding of the scriptures so that you can study them. That's always my goal, so you can study them on your own and get more out of the text and more out of what you're reading and have a better understanding of what's going on there. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to accomplish with all this stuff. And that's why I don't get off in flowery, conversations sometimes like a sermon will actually do. I don't sermonize as much. We do talk about other things at different times. But any other thoughts? We're all good. Okay. So again, if you're watching us on Facebook Live, we're going to take next week off, and stay tuned. If you're on the email list, I'll email you the notes for 1 Thessalonians and let you know in that email, yes, we're going to meet this week or not. But I know I need at least next week off to write. I may need the week off after that as well, to finish up a manuscript that I'm submitting soon. So, okay. All right. Let's say goodbye to our friends on Facebook and